Sezno. This is primarily a video about modes and how I understand and utilize the concept at this point in my life as a songwriter. I should mention that my thinking about modes has changed since I first became aware of the concept. And I'm sure there's other people who can explain this way better than I can, but I'll give it a shot. I'm sure you know how unpredictable and unforgiving social media platforms can be. If you like what I do, give me a follow on Instagram. I'm trying to do some more stuff over there. And check out my merch store as well. Thank you. Trying to understand mode has made me a better musician, I think, because it's made my ear more sensitive. It has broadened my intuition for the possibilities of a given idea. I think the main point that I want to make here, if you are a writer of music, a maker of music, mode basically enables you to do whatever you want. That's the simplest way I can put it, but in order to really do that, you can't think about it as a scale, because mode and scale are two very different things. Two of the misconceptions that I think a lot of 21st century musicians have about mode are, first, that a mode is a scale, and second, that modes are primarily altered versions of familiar scales. Neither of those statements are untrue exactly. They're also not completely unhelpful for a musician, but they derive a little bit too much from the concept of scale. Mode is far more than just an exotic sounding scale. Both of these misconceptions betray the particular time period that we're living in. But there's a much broader insight to be had on mode that comes from how it was understood and used centuries ago. Tapping into this requires at least a partial letting go of our current obsession with major and minor. That is, tonality, or music being something that is in a key. This letting go is important because tonal music and the ideas surrounding it form so much of our ground zero understanding and intuition about things like melody and harmony. And of course, the concept of the scale is heavily implicated in this. But in Western music, mode is a concept that predates tonality. Western composers were writing modal music for centuries before anybody ever wrote what we now call tonal music, before anybody sat down and explicitly wrote, for instance, something in the key of C major. The interaction between these two concepts, mode and scale, is complicated and misunderstood, partly because at this point, one has prevailed over the other. Tonal music is where we have ended up. And though there are plenty of similarities, the old modal music and tonal music approach melody and harmony from different viewpoints. Tonality, in a way, has corrupted the way that we think about mode in its older usage. I'm not going to give like the whole history of Western music here, even if I could. The basic line in the sand between modal music being the norm and tonal music being the norm is the 17th century, the 1600s, the start of the Baroque. The key developments in that period of music are the invention of the opera and the explosion of interest in writing instrumental music. Much of the older repertoire, so the medieval and Renaissance repertoire, is primarily vocal music. These were gradual developments in that century that led Western music towards being in a key, primarily. The idea that a piece of music or a passage of music is organized around one specific major or minor chord that carries the most gravity, the tonic, the one chord, and the harmony around it primarily uses diatonic chords, chords that are in the key, which you derive from combinations of the 7 notes in that particular major or minor scale. So in this period, you start to have intense emphasis on tension and resolution. Dissonant chords like the dominant 7th, the 5/7, become ubiquitous. These are some of the major ideas that are present in the function of tonal music. But the music before 1600, though, is modal. It doesn't work the same way. What's confusing about this distinction is that the old modal music utilizes the same elements as the newer tonal music: melody, harmony, consonance and dissonance, resolution, and cadences. Like, there's plenty of instances in the older modal music of what we would now call chord progressions that we still use to this day and are super familiar to us. When one studies the modes today, you learn that there are 7 of them. This is an idea that existed in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The definitions evolved as the music changed, but the 7 old church modes are basically the same today as they were back then. Today, though, these modes are introduced to us basically as scales. This notion is bolstered all the more by the fact that 2 of the 7 modes correspond to our 2 most familiar scales. The Ionian mode is the major scale. The Aeolian mode is the natural minor. For that reason, it has become very convenient for musicians to consider the other 5 modes as alterations of the major and minor scale. Like Phrygian is a natural minor with a flat 2. Mixolydian is a major scale with a flat 7, etc. Again, this is not like completely impractical because you need frames of reference, but it doesn't tell the whole story because the scales we know best came from the modes rather than the other way around. The Renaissance masters did not think of the modes as scales at all. So consider for a second why there would be differences between them in the first place. You can derive the relationships present in all 7 modes from just the white keys on the piano, except starting on different notes. Ionian is the white keys starting on C, Dorian starting on D, Phrygian starting on E, etc. But according to our modern notion of scale, though, C Ionian, D Dorian, and E Phrygian, as 3 examples, are kind of just variations of the same scale because they each consist of the same 7 notes, the white keys on the piano. So then why are they not the same? Why do the melodies and the harmonies of each of these modes sound different and distinct from one another? There is a quote from Jeppesen's book on Counterpoint that I want to bring up here. This is a classic textbook that's about 100 years old. It teaches part writing, melody, harmony, etc. from the perspective of 16th century modal style, using Palestrina as the main model, whose music you should check out if you haven't, because it's some of the most beautiful music ever written. So because of the time period, there's nothing in here about, say, harmonizing a 1-4-5-1, because that is a later tonal way of thinking, and nobody thought about it that way in Palestrina's day. There's so much great stuff in here about melody, harmony, mode, and scale, and how our notions of those things have evolved over the centuries. And the quote in here that is most crucial for me is, "It must be clearly understood that scale and mode are 2 very different things. Mode is living music, but the scale is only a dead abstraction, the material of the mode arranged according to pitch." I first read that like 3 or 4 years ago and I didn't understand it. I did not get what he meant by that, but time has passed and I understand it better now. The difference is huge. Mode is a state of fluidity, and scale is the summarized, abstracted version of the mode's ingredients. Scale is all the notes on paper. Mode, though, is the general resulting state that the scale behaves in when the music is happening. That is why mode is living music. It is not just the notes, but the general tendencies of those notes, the contours and the directions that emerge, the ways in which certain notes are emphasized and others are subordinated, and how the music elaborates these relationships is what constitutes mode. This is why E Phrygian and C major produce very different sounding music, even though the pitches are all the same. The hierarchy of those same 7 notes is very different between the 2 modes. One way to elaborate on this is by considering the role of the leading tone. The leading tone is typically the raised 7th degree of your scale. So in C major or C Ionian, your leading tone is B. This is the note that carries the most impetus to move back upwards towards the tonic. This impetus comes from the fact that the leading tone is a half step below the tonic, the note immediately below on the keyboard. Our modern ears are so familiar with half-step leading tones that in a tonal context, we intuitively expect it to go upwards. In your 5-1 in major, maybe the most important chordal relationship in tonal music, the leading tone is the 3rd of your 5 chord. So if you're playing G major chord, C major chord, the leading tone B is the 3rd of your G major chord. The presence of the leading tone in the 5 chord is a main contributor in making that 5-1 sounding forceful and directional. But say you're in C and you change that B to a B flat, so that now you had a flattened 7th degree. Now the relationship between the 7th degree and the 1st degree sounds very different. B flat is now a whole step below C. So it doesn't carry as much of a palpable impetus upwards. This is why different modes have different patterns of behavior, because the half steps and the whole steps are in different places. And this results in every mode having its own poles of gravity. Like, take the Phrygian, which is basically a natural minor with a flat 2. So E Phrygian would be all the white keys starting on E. So, of course, this mode contains F instead of F sharp, which is what you would find as the second degree in most other modes on E. If you're staying firmly in Phrygian, you can't create a proper 5-1 chord relationship because Phrygian doesn't have a raised seventh for a leading tone. In E Phrygian, you would need a D sharp for that, but instead, you have D. There's no half-step relationship between the 7th degree and the 1st degree. But you do have a half-step relationship between the 1st degree and the 2nd degree, E and F. This is pretty much the unique detail about Phrygian. It accounts for the particular sound that Phrygian has. Basically, this means the leading tone is above the tonic rather than below. So a great deal of resolution in Phrygian happens from upwards. So in Phrygian, you get weird shit like because you have to organize the white keys around E, the Phrygian mode utilizes its own patterns of movement to facilitate that. These consequences that come from whole steps and half steps account for why there are two different versions of the minor scale. Natural minor, which is the Aeolian, and harmonic minor. Minor is a mode in the truest sense, in that it is fluid. Its properties allow for flexibility and change according to the needs of each moment. I think there's only two versions of minor, though melodic minor is sometimes referred to as a third version, but really it just summarizes the first two in the context of one given line, a roadmap for a specific melody line in minor. Raised going up, lowered going down. Going upwards, a melody would raise the 6th and the 7th to more forcefully approach the tonic, but going downwards, you lower the 6th and the 7th degree for that more typical minor sound. This distinction comes from the modes. They didn't just invent two different scales. If you were to use the raised 6th and 7th exclusively in your passage in minor, it would sound distractingly major. But if you were to use a 5-1 in minor, you'd want that 5 chord to have the raised 7th. You'd want it to be major rather than minor. Though I should mention that exploring non-diatonic concepts like minor 5-1 is precisely the fun of using the modes. You find interesting routes and interesting solutions from these little differences. So if your tonic chord is E minor, note the difference between these two. The modes and the way that they behave account for why D and D sharp are both perfectly necessary and useful depending on the context. It should be mentioned that what I'm describing here is like the old school usage of mode. Mode has had many developments and interesting uses since the period that I've been talking about, but as I see it, the value of understanding mode in its earlier usage in like the Renaissance is putting together how and why the modes eventually resulted in tonal music. That is what happened. You have 7 original old church modes, but even by the days of Palestrina, only 5 of those 7 were really all that useful in polyphonic music. In Lydian, you couldn't get a consonant chord on 4, and Locrian is fucking Locrian. Then these 5 gradually gave way to Ionian and Aeolian being the most commonly used, and our modern diatonic, tonal, major and minor have resulted. Now, that is an egregious simplification of a lot of really complicated history, but neither you nor I have all day. Mode never went away from Western composition, even in the centuries that were largely focused on tonality. But it took on new meaning, especially in the 20th century, when tonality was breaking down and composers were looking for new ways to organize and construct their music. The modes made a huge return to the forefront at that point, helping to move music away from what was, by then, traditional tonal harmony. The dissonant or coloristic or otherwise modernist and postmodern usage of modes, even the familiar modes from the pre-tonal days, utilize those same concepts in very different ways. And that is super worth exploring. A lot of that music is really fascinating. Hopefully you can now see the big difference between the major scale, and the major mode. When you listen to a piece of music in major, you're not just hearing the major scale. What you're really hearing is the major mode in action, of which the major scale is just the basic list of pitch ingredients. In my opinion, the best way to uncover the unique properties of each mode, and modes of your own invention, because like that's totally possible also, but not use them exclusively as scales, but to try them out in action as harmony, and like use the equivalent of the diatonic chords in each mode. Like the Phrygian, play around with the chords that you can build from E Phrygian. And when you find yourself relating an E minor tonic sonority to chords like F major and B diminished and D minor, none of which you would find in the tonal key of E minor, you'll hear the strangeness in how different Phrygian actually is from the minor, and it will strengthen your ear to the differences in half steps and whole steps, and the different melodic and harmonic possibilities that result. If you watched this far, thank you. There's too much more that I could unpack, and this is still a concept that I am learning about. I've mentioned it in a few other videos. I am planning on discussing the way Kurt Cobain uses modes in his songwriting. Probably be a few videos, actually. Yeah, let me know what you would like to see. I hope you're all well. Much love. Peace.